Whispers spread through the mountain town like wildfire. Two tiny blonde twins appeared from the woods, barefoot, shivering, begging a man no one dared approach. They say he hadn't spoken in years, not since the fire that took his family. But when those girls clutched his coat and called him sir, he dropped to his knees and wept like a child. Why did he hide away for so long? What secret pain broke the mountain man? And what evil hunted those girls through the snow? This is the story of a broken soul, two innocent hearts, and a town forever changed. When two innocent voices called out through the snow, and a ghost of a man answered with tears, a new story began, one of healing, redemption, and unexpected family. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how these stories bring us together, no matter where we are or what we've lived through. If you still believe in goodness, second chances, and the quiet power of love, then this story belongs to you too. Tell me which state you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that matter. Snow fell like ash from the heavens, soft and silent, even as fire devoured the old farmhouse behind them. The flames crackled and roared, casting violent orange light against the dark curtain of pine that loomed ahead. Two tiny figures broke through the smoke, barefoot and breathless, their pale hair tangled with soot, their thin nightgowns torn by branches and wind. Each held the other's hand with a grip that would not break. They did not cry. Not yet. The taller of the two, by an inch and a heartbeat, glanced back just once. Her blue eyes reflected the blaze as if trying to memorize it, as if by staring she could take something back from what they'd lost. But the house, their home since their parents' funeral 3 years ago, was gone. Their uncle had made sure of it. The smell of kerosene still clung to their skin. "He's comin'," whispered the smaller twin, her voice hoarse from smoke. She stumbled on a root, and her sister caught her before she could fall. Behind them, in the chaos of the fire, the drunken screams of a man echoed into the trees. "Let's go," said the taller girl, voice flat with determination that only children broken too young could carry. "We go where Mama said. Mama's gone. But she said, there's a place in the mountains where the good people hide." The little one nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. They turned toward the forest, away from the fields and fences, and plunged into the wilderness. The Montana woods were not kind in January. Wind tore through the trees in long, bitter moans. The snow swallowed every footstep, every memory. Branches scraped their arms, and sharp stones bit their feet. Still, they ran, guided by starlight and the wild hope their mother had whispered to them long ago, before sickness took her and left them in the care of a man who saw them as burdens, not blessings. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes, but the darkness grew deeper. Their breaths became labored, visible like smoke from a train. The taller twin's lips turned purple. The smaller one began to drag behind. "I'm tired," she said, sinking to her knees. "No," her sister whispered, crouching beside her. "We have to go more. Just a little. I can't feel my toes." The taller one looked around. All was quiet except for the groaning wind and the distant snap of a tree branch under snow. Then, in the distance, a faint light, flickering, faint, not fire, something steadier. A lantern? She stood and pulled her sister up again. "Come on, someone's out there." They moved toward the light like moths, unsure whether it meant salvation or danger. Behind them, the farmhouse finally collapsed in a shower of sparks. What drove them wasn't courage, it was the absence of options. There was no going back, only forward, into the unknown, into the woods, into the arms of something they hoped would not strike them down. As the light grew closer, a shape began to form. A figure, tall, still, watching. The twins froze, and in that terrible silent moment, the wilderness seemed to hold its breath. The town of Willow Creek sat hunched beneath a blanket of snow, its chimneys puffing smoke like weary sighs into the gray sky. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing stayed secret for long except the man in the mountains. Folks didn't speak of him unless the wind howled or the wolves cried too close to town. Then, they whispered. Some said he had no name anymore, that he'd traded it for silence after the fire took his wife and child. Others claimed he went mad with grief, digging graves with bare hands and talking to shadows. Children dared each other to peer up at the ridge beyond the pine line, swearing they'd seen his lantern flicker there at dusk. Farmers blamed him when livestock went missing, and the preacher said he was a warning from God, a man who let sorrow make him a beast. They called him the Wild Man. The twins had heard the stories, not just from town, but from the sharp-tongued girls at church and the grocery woman who muttered too loudly. "Shoulda locked him up with the other drunks," she'd said once, not knowing two little ears were listening from behind a display of canned peaches. A man who don't talk ain't a man. He's something else. And yet, as they staggered deeper into the woods, cold gnawing at their bones and silence thickening like frost around them, the Wild Man became their only hope. Every other light had gone out. "Do you think he's real?" the smaller twin asked, voice trembling. "Yes," her sister answered without looking back. "What if he's mean? He's got a house. We saw the light." They didn't know what waited at the end of that flicker, but they kept moving. Not because they believed the stories were wrong, but because they needed one to be right. In the face of freezing death, even a monster with a roof was better than a grave made of snow. Back in town, as the fire's smoke reached the morning sky, folks gathered at the blackened ruins. The sheriff shook his head and spat into the dirt. "That man was drunker than a mule in spring flood. Ain't no telling what he did to those girls." "They're gone?" someone asked. "Gone," the sheriff confirmed. "Tracks head toward the hills." A hush fell. "The hills? Lord have mercy," murmured the midwife, pulling her shawl tighter. "If they're up there, they're as good as dead, or worse." "Someone should go," a rancher offered weakly, though he made no move. "They say he don't take kindly to visitors," said the blacksmith. "A man who buries his own and never comes down. That ain't someone waiting to help." But in the woods, none of that mattered. The twins no longer felt their toes, their fingers stiff with ice. The taller one pressed forward, carrying most of her sister's weight now. Her breath came in short, painful bursts. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, but she still whispered, "Just a little further." The stories wrapped around them like the wind warning them, urging them back. But desperation has a way of drowning out fear. And so, as the last light of day gave way to a violet dusk, the girls climbed toward the unknown, toward the one man the whole town feared, praying he would be nothing like they'd heard. Snowflakes clung to the lashes of the smaller twin as she collapsed into the drift, her breath shallow and thin. Her sister fell beside her, arms wrapped tight around her body, trying to keep her warm. The forest around them was silent, save for the sighing of trees as the wind wove between them. Their footsteps, once frantic and unsteady, had faded into nothing. There was no more running. Their strength was gone. Above them, the pines stood like ancient sentinels, unmoved by the suffering at their feet. A bird called once, then went still. The forest was holding its breath. Then something shifted. A crack, not loud, but heavy, like a branch under slow weight, broke the stillness. The taller girl blinked through blurred eyes, and in the dim light of dusk, a shape emerged from the tree line. Not an animal, not a man, something in between, huge, broad-shouldered, moving with the silence of something used to being alone. Snow didn't crunch beneath his boots, it parted. He stood over them, a mountain of a figure cloaked in a heavy wool coat, darkened by years of wear and rain. A hood shadowed his face, but beneath it, a thick beard covered the lower half of what might once have been a kind face. Now, it was carved with the hard lines of a man who hadn't spoken in years. The smaller twin whimpered. Her sister turned her body, trying to shield her with what little strength she had. The man didn't move for a long while. Then, slowly, he knelt. His gloves were coarse, stitched and restitched, but his hands were steady. He touched the older twin's forehead, then pressed 2 fingers to her sister's neck. A beat, faint, but there, a sigh, not from them, but from him. Without a word, he moved. He lifted the smaller girl first, cradling her against his chest. She was so light she barely weighed more than his pack. Then the other. She tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. "Please don't." But he didn't hurt them. He didn't speak either. He turned, with one child in each arm, and walked back into the trees. The trail he followed was nearly invisible, covered in fresh snow and tucked between the thickest brambles, but he moved without hesitation. The woods grew denser as he climbed a ridge, then dipped into a hollow where the trees gave way to a clearing. Nestled between two mossy boulders stood a cabin, half swallowed by the forest. Its roof sagged slightly, but smoke curled from the chimney. Light flickered behind thick-paned windows. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The warmth hit the girls like a wave. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine tar, and something cooking beans or stew. The man laid them gently onto a worn bearskin rug by the hearth. He peeled off their wet clothes with care and wrapped each in woolen blankets, moving with the instinct of someone who had once known how to care for others. Still, he said nothing. The fire cracked. The girls shivered, half-conscious, too cold to speak, but their eyes fluttered open now and then, enough to see the outline of the man as he moved. He worked in silence, hanging their clothes near the heat, ladling broth from a pot into tin cups, setting them beside them. His face was unreadable, not unkind, but not soft either, like stone that had once been warm and had since forgotten how. The wind howled outside. Inside, the only sound was the ticking of an old clock and the quiet rise and fall of the girl's breath. The man sat in the far corner, his shadow stretching long across the cabin floor. He didn't sleep. He just watched. And in his stillness, the cabin became something else. Not a shelter, not yet a home, but not a place of harm either. It was the edge of something new, something not even he understood yet. The fire snapped and hissed as the cabin held its warmth like a secret. The twins lay side by side on a rough quilt folded over the bearskin rug, swaddled in thick blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Their skin, pale and blotched from the cold, flushed now with the faint glow of returning blood. The taller girl shivered still, though not from cold. Her arms remained around her sister, protective even in exhaustion. Across the room, the mountain man moved with the silence of a ghost. He had not spoken, not a greeting, not a question. He poured warm water from a kettle into a basin and set it near the hearth. His back was a broad wall of flannel and wool. When he turned, his heavy beard and long hair caught the firelight, casting strange shadows over his face, but his hands were deliberate, steady. He knelt beside the girls, dipped a cloth into the water, and gently pressed it to their blistered feet. The younger twin flinched, her body recoiling as if from pain or fear. The older one squeezed her hand, whispering, "Don't cry. He ain't hurting us." The man didn't look at them directly. His eyes stayed on the task, never lingering, never wandering. He dried their feet with a piece of linen worn to near transparency, then dabbed salve onto the raw skin. When one girl coughed, he moved quickly, returning with a spoon and a dark jar of syrupy medicine. He offered it without a word. She took it without one. Time moved differently in the cabin. The wind outside scratched at the walls like hungry fingers, but inside there was only the rhythm of the fire and the creak of floorboards under his steps. The girls didn't know if it was morning or night. They whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. "Why won't he say nothin'?" the little one murmured, voice still thin. "Maybe he don't got words no more," her sister answered. "Maybe he forgot how." "He's big," the little one said, "but he don't yell. I know. He ain't like Uncle." The older girl looked around. The cabin, though simple, was cared for. A rocking chair rested near the fire, worn smooth at the arms. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars of preserved fruit and bundles of dried herbs. A rifle hung over the door, but untouched. There were boots by the hearth, too large for anyone but him, and a coat mended so many times it looked patched together from memory. Then she saw it. Near the window, tucked between two carved wooden figurines on a narrow shelf, a single piece of paper curled at the edges. It was a child's drawing, faded and clumsy, made with crayon. A figure with yellow hair and a smiling face stood beside a larger figure holding a flower. In a shaky hand, the name Anna had been written in red. The older twin nudged her sister and pointed. The younger girl stared at the drawing, then at the man. "He had a kid?" she whispered. The man didn't react, but as he stood near the door and stared out into the night, something flickered across his face. Not sorrow, not memory, something quieter, something buried, The girls didn't understand it, not yet, but they knew he hadn't made the drawing himself, that someone once had, someone small, someone loved. He didn't look at them. He didn't speak. But when he walked to the fire and gently laid another log onto the flames, it was not just for warmth. It was a gesture, quiet, simple, and unmistakably human. And the twins, for the first time since the fire, began to believe they might be safe. The days passed in slow procession, marked by the creak of the old cabin's roof in the wind and the steady ticking of a brass clock mounted above the hearth. Snow still lay heavy over the hills, but inside the cabin, warmth grew not only from the fire, but from something less visible, something unspoken that began to fill the spaces between the three of them. The girls no longer flinched at his steps. The fever had broken, and their cheeks, once hollow and pale, had gained color. The smaller twin had taken to sleeping with her head tucked under her sister's arm, both of them cocooned in blankets too large for their frames. They still whispered, but now it was not from fear. It was the soft, aimless chatter of children, unburdened by immediate danger. He, still silent, still unnamed to them, had begun to move differently, less like a man surviving the wilderness, more like someone tending a home. Each morning, he cooked something simple: oats with honey, thick slices of bread toasted by the fire, stewed apples with clove. He didn't eat with them, only set the bowls out and watched from his corner as they ate, his eyes unreadable but fixed. One morning, the girls awoke to find 2 pairs of mittens resting on the stool near their bedding. Stitched by hand from thick wool, the patterns were mismatched and crooked, but they fit. The taller twin slid hers on and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once, then turned back to the hearth. Later that day, he brought out his knife, not the hunting kind, but a smaller one, used for shaping, and a block of pine. He sat by the fire and carved, slowly, patiently. The girls watched. His hands, scarred and rough, moved with a surprising gentleness. By dusk, he had shaped 2 little animals, a deer and a bear. He handed them over wordlessly, one to each girl. They held them like treasures. The smaller twin clutched hers to her chest. "He made it," she whispered, as if afraid saying it too loud would make the moment disappear. That night, as snow tapped softly on the windows and the fire flickered against the walls, the girls curled up together beneath their blankets. The taller one began to hum a low, broken tune their mother used to sing while brushing their hair. It was a melody without words, just notes shaped by memory. He had been stacking kindling in the corner. When the sound reached him, he paused. His back stiffened. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he turned. She kept humming. The smaller twin joined in, softly, uncertain at first, but growing in confidence. The sound filled the little cabin with something fragile and beautiful. He sat down slowly, lowering himself into the old rocking chair. His eyes didn't meet theirs. He stared into the fire, his hands rested on his knees, unmoving, and then, quietly, tears welled in his eyes. He did not sob, he did not shake, but the firelight caught the wet lines on his cheeks, traced them like rivers through the dust of years gone uncried. The girls did not speak. They simply kept humming, their voices mingling like smoke in the warm air, and the man once called a monster sat beneath the drawing of a child long gone, his silence no longer empty, but full. Morning light filtered through the frost-laced windows, casting pale gold across the wooden floorboards. The fire had burned low during the night, but the cabin still held its warmth. The taller twin stirred first, sitting up beneath the quilt, her hair tangled and eyes puffy from sleep. Her sister mumbled beside her, still curled into herself, hugging the wooden deer he had carved. The man, silent as ever, was already awake. He stood at the stove, ladling hot porridge into 2 mismatched bowls. Steam rose like breath into the still air. He set the bowls on the low table near the hearth, then stepped back into his usual place, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching with that same quiet focus that said more than any words. The taller twin stood, wrapped in a wool blanket like a cape. She approached the bowls, her bare feet padding softly on the rug. She looked at him, really looked at him, studying his face the way a child studies a map, trying to find a way through. She didn't speak until her sister had joined her, and they were both sitting cross-legged with the bowls in their laps. "Mister," she said softly. Do you got a name? He blinked slowly. A pause stretched between them like a drawn string. The smaller twin looked up too, spoon halfway to her mouth. You don't have to tell us if it hurts, she added, but we want to call you something. Not mister. That don't sound right. He didn't move. For a moment they thought he wouldn't answer. But then he shifted just slightly, and his gaze dropped to the fire. Elias, he said, voice hoarse and unused but steady. My name's Elias. The girls nodded solemnly, as if he'd entrusted them with something sacred. The older one smiled. Thank you, she said. That night, after they were asleep, Elias sat in the rocking chair, staring at the flames. He hadn't spoken his name in years. He wasn't sure why it had come out so easily. Maybe it was their eyes. The way they looked at him, not with pity, not with fear, but with something else, something warm and steady, like a lantern in a snowstorm. After a long while, he rose. He crossed the room, careful not to wake them, and knelt beside the bed frame. From beneath it, he pulled a small trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with rusted hinges. A lock hung from the clasp, old but still sound. He removed a key from a leather thong around his neck and opened it. Inside lay the remnants of another life. A folded shawl, once red, now faded to rose, worn at the edges but still soft. He touched it with 2 fingers, reverent. Beneath it, a baby's white bonnet, yellowed with time. The stitches were tiny, the cloth delicate. He lifted it to his face for a moment, then placed it back down gently. At the bottom, folded with care, was a letter. The paper was creased and damp at the corners, its ink smudged in places. A tear had blurred a single name, Anna. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to. He knew every word. He knew the loops of her handwriting, the rhythm of her voice in the lines. He left the trunk open that night, left the shawl on the chair, left the letter where it could breathe, and when he went to sit again, he didn't lean into the shadows like he used to. He sat closer to the hearth. The girls didn't stir, but in their sleep, one reached for the other. Elias watched them as the firelight danced across the walls, and for the first time in years, his heart beat not with grief alone, but with memory and something tender, almost too fragile to name. The sun had barely cleared the mountain ridge when Elias set out with the girls bundled in thick coats and woolen scarves he'd stitched himself. The snow crunched beneath their boots in soft, measured steps. The air was sharp with winter's breath, but the wind had quieted, as if the forest itself had decided to listen. They walked in silence, winding through the trees behind the cabin, where a narrow trail wove through snow-laden firs. The girls didn't ask where they were going. Something in Elias's stillness told them this was a place that mattered. His gait was slower than usual, more deliberate. He carried no tools, no weapons, only a small bundle tucked beneath his coat, wrapped in the red shawl from the trunk. It wasn't far, though the hush made it feel like another world entirely. When they came into the clearing, the trees gave way to a wide patch of open white. There, beneath a crust of snow, 2 wooden crosses stood side by side, no names carved, no markers save the way Elias looked at them, as if they had never left. He stopped a few paces from the graves and took off his hat. The twins lingered behind him, unsure. Then, as if pulled by instinct, they stepped forward, one on each side. Elias knelt in the snow. His coat sagged under the weight of age and memory, his breath curling in slow plumes as he lowered his head. For a long while, he said nothing. The girls watched him, hands clutching each other's, eyes wide. Then he opened his mouth. Lord, he said, voice rough with rust and time, I ain't prayed in years, and I reckon you stopped listening a long time ago, but I brought 'em here, same as I once promised I'd never bring another soul. He paused, eyes fixed on the crosses, as if waiting for a sign. None came. They're good girls, scared, but strong. Remind me of her, not just Anna, the way she smiled, the way she looked at me like I was more than I was, but the baby too, the little one. She had eyes just like hers. That same light, that same quiet kind of brave. The bundle in his coat shifted. Elias pulled it out slowly and unwrapped it, revealing the tiny bonnet, yellowed with time, and a handful of dried wildflowers tied with string. I brought these, he whispered. setting the bonnet at the base of one cross, the flowers at the other. I know it's late. I know it ain't enough. The taller twin stepped forward first. Without a word, she knelt beside him, slipping her small hand into his calloused one. Her sister followed a heartbeat later, taking his other side. They didn't speak, didn't ask questions. They just sat with him, their warmth against his arms, their presence anchoring him to the now. Elias bowed his head again, and this time the words came softer. "You'd like 'em," he said to the graves. "You'd want me to keep 'em safe. And I will. I swear it. No man's taken them from me. Not while I draw breath." The snow began to fall, slow and gentle, like a blanket being drawn across the earth. For a long time, they sat there in the stillness, three figures in the snow, bound by loss and something newly forming. When they finally stood, Elias touched each cross with the edge of his glove, then looked at the girls. His eyes weren't dry, but they weren't heavy anymore either. They walked back together, not as strangers, not anymore. By the time the snow receded and green touched the earth again, the cabin had grown quieter in a different way, not the silence of sorrow or strangers, but the peace of a home slowly learning to breathe again. Spring came in cautious steps, creeping down from the mountains like a promise finally kept. Tiny shoots of green pushed through the thawing soil. Birds returned with cautious song, and the wind that once howled like grief now whistled soft tunes through the eaves. The girls awoke with the sun most days, their cheeks pink with health and their hair growing long again. They moved easily through the cabin, no longer visitors but occupants. The older twin swept the hearth without being asked, her small hands strong and practiced. The younger, always humming some tune, had taken to naming everything: the chickens, the buckets, the tree outside the window that bent a little to the left. Elias had cleared a space beside the shed where goats now grazed. They weren't many, 3, maybe 4, but the girls fed them each morning, laughing when the smallest one tugged at their sleeves. He built a fence to keep them safe, with the girls holding nails and handing him tools. He never told them what to do, never gave orders. He simply worked beside them, and they followed, learning by his rhythm. Out in the woods, he showed them how to spot yarrow and sweet mint, how to look for mushrooms under rotted logs, and how to listen for bees near wild hives. The older twin took to it quickly, asking questions in a soft, serious tone. The younger one twirled through the underbrush, gathering leaves like treasures, her cheeks streaked with charcoal and moss. He carved them tools for gathering and drying, even made a press for flattening plants between heavy boards. When they weren't helping him or exploring, they sat in the clearing with charcoal sticks and rough paper, sketching birds, deer, trees, and sometimes the cabin itself. Elias watched them from a distance at first, always lingering nearby, always pretending not to look. But one evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the trees gold, he crouched beside the older girl and studied her sketch of a fox. "You got her ears just right," he said. She blinked, surprised. "You think so?" He nodded. "Foxes carry a bit of mischief in the way they hold their ears. Most folks miss that. You didn't." The younger twin gasped. "You talked! A whole sentence!" He chuckled then, just once, a low, almost startled sound. It made both girls laugh, more from joy than humor. That night, for the first time, Elias took the tattered Bible from the shelf. Its leather cover was worn thin, and the pages yellowed, but his fingers turned them with reverence. The girls sat on the rug, wrapped in a single quilt, eyes wide as his voice read from the Psalms, slow and careful. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," he read. "He restoreth my soul." When he finished, he looked up and found both girls watching him, not just listening, but absorbing every word, as if it were something sacred passed down like bread. "You read nice," the younger one said. "Like a river." He smiled then, just barely, but it was real. That night, the fire crackled low, the goats bleated softly in their pen, and Elias sat with the Bible in his lap, 2 sleeping girls curled nearby. The grief that once filled the cabin had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It lived now alongside hope, quiet and steady. And for the first time in years, Elias felt not only like a man again, but like someone who might belong to something once more. The attic had always been a place Elias avoided. The ladder to it groaned like a wounded thing, and the trapdoor creaked open with a reluctance that spoke of years untouched. Dust floated in the sunlight like ash as the twins climbed carefully, drawn by the mystery of what lay above. They'd asked permission with wide eyes and hopeful voices, and Elias, after a pause long enough to feel like a warning, had nodded once. The space was cramped and musty, the roof sloping low, but it held the kind of treasures children dream about: a trunk with rusted hinges, a shelf of old books whose titles had faded, a stack of quilts, hand-stitched with patterns they didn't recognize. But what caught the younger twins' eye sat half-covered by a fraying cloth, leaning in the corner like it had been forgotten by time itself. She pulled it free, brushing off the dust with care. The wood was dark and dry, the strings brittle with age, but the shape was unmistakable. A fiddle. She cradled it like something sacred and called to her sister. Together, they brought it down, the younger one carrying the bow, the older one holding the instrument close to her chest. When Elias saw it, his entire body went still. "Where'd you find that?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "In the attic," the older twin replied. "Was it yours?" He stared at it for a long time, his eyes darkening like a storm rolling over the mountains. "It was hers," he said finally. The girls looked at each other. "Your wife?" the smaller one asked gently. He nodded once, slowly. "She played it?" the older girl asked. "Every night," Elias murmured, "even after the baby came. She'd rock her to sleep with it. Said the trees played along when she hit the right note. He didn't reach for it. Will you play?" the younger one asked. He shook his head. "It's been too long." A heavy silence settled between them. Elias turned back to his work, but the girls didn't put the fiddle away. That evening, as the sun bled into the treetops and the goats rustled in their pen, the younger twin walked over and placed the fiddle in his lap without a word. He stared at it, unmoving. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She simply walked back to her sister and sat by the fire. Elias looked down at the worn wood, his rough fingers tracing the neck. Slowly, almost involuntarily, he lifted it. His left hand found the strings, his right the bow. The posture came back like breath natural, remembered. The first sound was shaky, a hollow, uncertain note that wavered in the air. Then another and another, forming a melody that had slept in the walls of the cabin for years. A lullaby, soft and full of longing, notes strung together like prayer. The girls sat silent, their eyes wide. Outside, the wind stilled. The trees seemed to hush. The music filled the room like light. It climbed the walls, settled in the rafters, danced across the worn floor. Elias's eyes closed as the bow moved with more confidence, the melody deepening, pulling memory and sorrow and something sweeter from the strings. When the final note faded, he sat still for a long while. Then he placed the fiddle gently beside the fire and stared into the flames. That night, he slept in his bed for the first time in months. No startles, no cries in the dark, just the quiet breathing of two girls nearby and the fading echo of a song long buried. In the morning, the fiddle remained by the hearth, waiting, not forgotten, but returned. The sun shone too brightly for a man like Cyrus Blackthorne. He arrived in Willow Creek wearing city clothes too fine for dust roads, boots polished, coat stiff with starch, and a hat that hadn't once seen snow. He stepped down from the stagecoach with the smooth assurance of a man who believed ownership extended to whatever he could point at. Behind him came two men, lean, hard-eyed, their jackets bulging at the hips with the weight of holstered pistols and long practice. Cyrus smiled with all his teeth and none of his heart. He swept off his hat and turned to the crowd gathering at the edge of the general store. "Fine town you got here," he drawled, eyes scanning faces like he was picking fruit. "Name's Cyrus Blackthorne. Come all the way from Butte." The sheriff stepped forward, hands on his belt, suspicious. "Business?" "Family," Cyrus said, as if that answered everything. "I'm here for my nieces." That caught everyone's attention. Martha, the midwife, frowned, her arms crossed. "You mean the twins? The ones run off months ago?" "They didn't run off," Cyrus corrected smoothly. "They were taken, stolen, by a madman squatting on company land. Their uncle, my cousin, had guardianship, a legal matter. Tragic what happened to him. Burned down his own house, they say. Drank himself dead. The townsfolk shifted uneasily. The name of Elias was already heavy in the air. I represent the continental northwest line, Cyrus continued, pulling a folded deed from his coat pocket. We've bought up the North Ridge, and the land that man lives on is part of it. He's trespassing and holding children that ain't his. The sheriff took the paper, squinting at it. It was real legal stamps, signatures, official-looking enough to turn heads. Cyrus leaned closer, voice low. You do your job, Sheriff. Deliver the girls, or the company'll send men who won't be so polite. That evening, the saloon buzzed like a kicked beehive. The regulars drank harder, talked louder. They say he's coming down off the ridge soon, someone muttered. Old Elias, that ghost. He won't stand a chance, another said. Railroad don't care who's buried where, long as they get through. Cyrus stayed at the inn, occupying the finest room and spreading his maps across the bed like a general before battle. Red lines crossed green mountains, his finger tracing the route straight through Elias's homestead. This'll be steam before summer, he told his hired men. Once that land's cleared and the girls are back where they belong, I'll have no obstacles. We'll flatten that ridge if we have to. One of the men spat into a tin. You really think that old man's going to give up easy? Cyrus grinned. They say he hasn't spoken in years, that he's broken, and broken men don't fight. But he was wrong. Out in the mountains, Elias stood on the porch as a hawk circled overhead, the twins playing nearby with a goat tugging at their skirts. A change was coming. The wind smelled different, tense, telling. He'd known peace was a borrowed thing. Now the debt had come due, and deep in his chest, the fire that had long been ashes stirred again. The knock came just after sundown, soft but firm against the old cabin door. Elias had already lit the lantern, its glow casting long amber shadows across the worn floorboards. The twins looked up from where they sat, arranging pine cones and acorns into tiny shapes, their play a quiet echo of peace. Elias rose without hurry, but something in the way he moved, stiffer, slower, spoke of a man who already knew what news was waiting on the other side. He opened the door to find Martha standing there, bundled in a shawl, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the climb. She was not a young woman, but the mountain had never bested her. Her boots were muddy, her brow lined with wisdom earned in silence, and her mouth pressed thin with urgency. I came alone, she said without ceremony. Didn't want the whole town seeing. Elias stepped aside, and she entered, brushing snow from her sleeves. The twins greeted her shyly, but warmly they knew her now, the kind woman who'd stitched their feet in town weeks ago when Elias brought them in, quiet as ghosts. She looked at them, smiled, then turned to him. They'll come at dawn. He said nothing, just waited. Cyrus has men with him, hired guns, and papers stamped from the city. Says he's got a claim to the land. Says the girls are kin, by blood if not by right. She lowered her voice. It don't matter that he's scum. The law'll take his side unless someone speaks. Elias looked past her, out the window, toward the dark pines. Then, I'll be ready. I don't mean with a rifle, Elias. He flinched slightly, then set his jaw. Martha stepped closer, lowering her voice. You can't disappear again. Not this time. You can't let that man take them because you think your silence is strength. They're not mine, Elias said, eyes fixed on the fire. I found them in the snow. That don't make me anything. That makes you everything, she snapped, fiercer than expected. You didn't turn them away. You fed them, clothed them, held their hands at a grave that wasn't even theirs to mourn. He didn't reply. The twins watched from the rug, holding each other's hands. You come to the meeting tomorrow, Martha said. You stand up, Elias. You tell them what those girls mean to you, what they mean to this town. I don't belong there, he muttered, barely audible. She stepped even closer, eyes blazing. You don't get to say that anymore, not after what you've done for them, not after how they look at you. His eyes dropped to the floor. Please, she added, voice softening. If not for you, then for them. He looked at the girls, one already falling asleep, the other watching him with quiet hope. He saw his wife in that gaze, and his daughter too, like echoes trying to guide him back towards something he'd left behind long ago. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind picked up. And in that fragile space between past and present, Elias nodded once, not for himself, for them. The sun had not yet fully risen when Elias stepped off the ridge and began the long walk into town. Mist clung low over the valley, curling through the trees like a warning or a memory. He wore his oldest coat, the one patched so many times it barely held its shape, and in his hand he carried the red shawl. He didn't ride, he didn't rush. Each step was measured, grounded. The twins walked beside him, their hands in his. The younger one clutched her carved wooden bear. The older kept glancing up at him, as if trying to be brave on his behalf. When they reached the edge of Willow Creek, heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Shopkeepers froze in their doorways. A dog barked once, then went quiet. Elias had not been seen in town for nearly 10 years, not since the day they buried his wife and daughter, not since the day he left without a word and never came back. Now he stood tall, not proud, not angry, simply present, as if he had walked out of a grave and decided to live again. Martha waited at the steps of the old town hall, flanked by the preacher and a few townsfolk who had once watched Elias dig 2 small graves with his bare hands. She nodded as he approached, a look of quiet thanks in her eyes. Inside, the meeting had already begun. Cyrus Blackthorne stood before the council, his smile easy and confident, legal papers in hand, his 2 men watching from the back of the room like shadows with teeth. "It's a simple matter," he was saying. "Guardianship, abandoned land, property transfer, all clean, all lawful." Then the door opened. The sound was small, but it might as well have been thunder. Every head turned. Elias stepped into the room, the twins at his side. The preacher's eyes widened. A woman gasped. Cyrus's smile faltered, just slightly. "I'd like to speak," Elias said. The mayor hesitated, glancing at Cyrus, then at Martha, then back at Elias. You have the floor." Elias stepped forward. The twins sat on the front bench, hands folded in their laps. He looked down at them for strength, then raised his eyes to the room. "My name is Elias McAllister. Some of you remember me. Most of you remember what happened." He paused, his voice raw from disuse. "My wife, Anna, and our daughter, Elsie, died in a fire 10 winters ago. I tried to save them. I failed. And I stopped living. I buried them, and myself." He gripped the shawl in his hand, knuckles white. "I built a wall between me and the world. Let the rumors grow. Let you all believe I'd turned wild. Maybe I had. I didn't care." He looked at the twins now. They stared up at him with absolute trust. Then one night, these 2 girls showed up in the snow, sick, half dead. They didn't ask questions. They didn't run. They just needed someone to stay. And I stayed. He swallowed, voice cracking. "They don't belong to me by blood, but they're mine now. Not by law, by choice." He turned to the council, eyes steady. "You want to talk about who deserves them? Who protects them? I didn't find them in a courtroom. I found them freezing to death, chased by a man who called himself their kin. I didn't plan to care, but they saved me, pulled me back from a place I thought I'd never leave." He looked straight at Cyrus. "You can buy land. You can forge papers, but you can't buy what those girls gave me. And you sure as hell can't take it." The room was still. Then someone stood. "The blacksmith. He's right." Another voice followed. "The shopkeeper's wife. He raised them better in 3 months than their uncle did in 3 years." Martha stepped forward, voice clear. "I've seen him with them. I've seen the healing. If that isn't family, I don't know what is." And for the first time in a decade, Elias breathed fully, not as a recluse, not as a ghost, as a man who had finally found his voice. The room remained hushed after Elias finished, the silence thick and reverent. His words had settled like snow across every wooden bench and heart in the old hall, and no one moved, not even the girls, who sat still and watchful as if sensing something sacred had passed between them and the town. Elias stood quiet now, his shoulders squared but his eyes lowered, like a man who'd given everything he had and could only wait for the world to decide what it would do with it. Then Martha stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I've lived in this town near on 60 years," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I've brought more babies into this world than I can count, and I've buried too many before their time." She looked to Elias. "When Anna died, we lost more than a mother and a wife. We lost the best part of a man we all thought we knew, and we failed him, every one of us." The silence deepened. He didn't turn away from those girls. He didn't hide when they needed him. He stood up. He came down that mountain and stood before you now, not for himself, but for them. If that's not a father, I don't know what is. A soft murmur passed through the benches. Then the preacher stood, his Bible tucked beneath one arm. "Redemption isn't something you're born with," he said. "It's something you earn." Elias earned his when he took those children in and didn't let the weight of his grief turn him bitter. He could have stayed hidden, could have let them die out there, but he didn't, and we've seen that kind of grace before. We just forgot what it looked like. A few heads nodded. Then another voice rose from the back. "Mr. Clevens, the old shopkeep. He once hauled firewood down to my place every week the winter my leg was broke. Didn't ask for pay, just left it on the porch. Helped me pull my mule out of the creek," said the blacksmith, standing now, "back when I was too proud to ask for help. Fixed our roof after that storm," added a woman near the front. "Didn't say a word, just showed up and worked till sundown." Voices began to swell. One by one, the town remembered the quiet deeds, the silent kindnesses Elias had offered without ever asking for thanks. They'd forgotten the man before the grief. Or maybe they'd just been too scared to look past the silence. Now they saw him fully, standing not as a ghost, but as someone who had never truly left. Cyrus shifted where he stood, his mouth drawn in a tight line. The confidence he'd worn like armor began to crack. He glanced at the sheriff, then at his hired men, who now seemed less sure of their footing. His fingers tightened around the legal papers in his hand, but their weight meant little against the stories now rising in the room. "He's just a man," Cyrus said, voice cold. "A broken one. That doesn't make him right." "It makes him real," Martha replied, her voice calm and final. A hush fell again, but this one was different. Not waiting for judgment, perhaps, but not of Elias. The tide had shifted, not with fury, not with noise, but with memory and moral weight. The town had seen enough. And somewhere deep within Elias's chest, the heavy door he had once locked shut began to creak open. The moon hung low over the ridge, casting long silver shadows across the clearing. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their limbs still and watchful. Inside the cabin, the fire had dwindled to embers, and the twins slept peacefully under thick quilts, their breathing soft and even. But Elias did not sleep. He sat by the window, his rifle across his knees, eyes sharp as flint, watching the dark woods with the quiet patience of a man who knew the shape of danger. He'd seen it before in war, in fire, in grief, and now it was coming again, not in the form of flames or loss, but of men too cowardly to strike by day. Martha's warning had been right. Cyrus had smiled in the council room, but that kind of man didn't lose gracefully. He'd let the legal route play out for show, but Elias had known the real challenge would come when no one was watching. The first sign was silence too perfect, too absolute. The forest always whispered at night, wind against bark, owls calling, coyotes yipping from afar. But tonight, the hush was thick and unnatural. Then a crack. Not from a branch beneath a deer's hoof, but from a boot on frozen timber. Elias rose, moved to the door. He didn't open it, just listened. Another step, then two more, then the sharp scent of smoke. He grabbed the lantern, threw on his coat, and stepped outside. The barn was already alight, flames licking along the roofline like fingers tearing through paper. The fence, newly built and straight just yesterday, had been chopped through in sections boards, splintered and charred. One of the goats lay still, neck broken, body twisted unnaturally in the snow. A shout came from the woods, followed by the laughter of men trying to sound braver than they felt. "Thought you'd scare us off with your sad little speech?" a voice called. "This ridge don't belong to ghosts, old man." Elias didn't shout back. He moved with purpose, stepping out into the clearing, his boots crunching over frost and ash. He raised the rifle, not toward the fire, but toward the trees. "I don't need to scare you," he said, his voice low and calm. "I just need to stop you." He fired once into the air. The blast echoed through the forest like thunder. A warning, not a cry. Another laugh from the darkness, this one thinner. A scuffle. Then silence. When the smoke cleared, they were gone. No more footsteps, no more jeers, just the crackling of what was left of the barn and the smell of scorched hay and timber. Elias stood there for a long while, watching the fire die down. He didn't lower the rifle. His hands were steady. His eyes burned not with fear, but with something older, something that had been buried too long, resolve. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, he paused beneath the window. The girls were still asleep, untouched by the chaos. Safe, for now. He returned to the doorway, took one last look at the woods, and whispered, "Next time, you don't get a warning." Then he shut the door and sat in the shadows, eyes fixed on the night, guarding not just a home but the future he refused to lose. The morning after the fire, the air smelled of ash and damp earth. Smoke still curled from the scorched barn timbers, rising in lazy tendrils toward a sky bruised with cloud. The goats that had survived pressed close to the cabin, nervous and restless. Elias had barely slept, his rifle across his lap and his eyes never straying far from the tree line. He didn't say much when the girls rose, only handed them warm bread and gestured for them to stay close. But it was the smaller twin, always the curious one, who found it. She had gone searching for a bit of thread near the chest in the corner, the one Elias rarely opened. Tucked beneath a stack of old papers and a rusted lantern, she found a leather-bound ledger and a bundle of folded letters tied with a red ribbon, brittle with age. She opened the top one, her fingers careful. The handwriting was jagged, impatient, and angry. Her eyes scanned it once, then again. "Elias?" she whispered. "What does this mean?" He turned at the sound of her voice, saw the paper in her hands. Something in him froze. He took the letter and sat down slowly, unfolding it on the table, smoothing the creases like he was taming something venomous. It was signed by Cyrus Blackthorne, dated nearly a year before the fire. The words were plain, without pretense. A bargain. Cyrus had paid their uncle a sum of money large enough to matter in a town like Willow Creek for the care, custody, and full authority over the twin minors, hereafter referred to as property held under supervision for future claim or relocation. No signatures from a court, no oversight, just money and ink and greed. Elias stared at the words. His hands tightened into fists, the paper crumpling slightly. The girls stood silently, watching him. He rose. No words, just movement. He pulled on his coat, took the letter and the ledger, and slid the rifle into the canvas sheath strapped across his back. The twins followed him to the edge of the porch, unsure if they should speak. "Where are you going?" the older one asked. He looked back at them, his voice low and clear. "To finish this." Down the ridge he went, boots sinking into thawing earth. By the time he reached town, the courthouse bell had just begun to chime the hour. Townsfolk gathered near the steps, murmuring in hushed tones. A judge from Helena sent down to settle the land dispute between the railroad and local holdings had arrived that morning. His carriage still gleamed with the dust of the trail. Inside, the hearing had already begun. Cyrus stood at the front of the chamber, gesturing confidently to maps spread across the table. "As you'll see, Your Honor, the deeds are in order. The cabin lies squarely within the path purchased for development. We've made every legal effort to contact the current occupant, but the door slammed open. Elias stepped inside. His presence alone stilled the room. He walked to the center, unbothered by the glares, the whispers, the guns at the waist of Cyrus's men. He placed the crumpled letter on the table and slid it toward the judge. "You missed one document," he said. The judge raised an eyebrow, unfolding the letter with measured hands. His eyes scanned it, then narrowed. "What is this?" he asked sharply. "A private agreement," Elias answered. "Illegal guardianship, purchase of children." Cyrus's face twitched. That letter was never meant to— No, Elias said, his voice steel. It wasn't, but it was written, and it changes everything. The judge looked at Cyrus, then at the sheriff, then back to the letter. For the first time, Cyrus Blackthorne had no answer, only silence, and the weight of his own words staring back at him in ink. The pews of Willow Creek's old church were packed shoulder to shoulder, the creak of boots on wood and the shuffle of uneasy whispers filling the vaulted space. The pulpit, once reserved for scripture, now bore maps, ledgers, and legal documents under the eye of a traveling judge in a dark wool coat. Candlelight flickered across the stained glass windows, casting red and blue halos on the floor, as if the saints themselves watched over the strange reckoning now unfolding in their house. Elias stood at the center, silent and steady, the girls pressed close to his legs. Their hands clutched his coat as if he were the only unmoving thing in a world spinning too fast. Across from him, Cyrus Blackthorne leaned on the edge of the makeshift table, his smile thinner than it had been that morning. His hair was still neat, but the lines at his temples had deepened. "Your Honor," Cyrus said with affected charm, "the man you see here, Elias McAllister, has no claim, legal or otherwise, to those children. My letter," he gestured with an open hand, "was never enacted. The agreement was voided when their uncle passed. The land, as per deed, belongs to the Continental Northwest Line. We have plans to develop—" "Save your pitch," the judge cut in, his voice gravel over stone. He held the letter Elias had submitted between gloved fingers. This letter speaks of human guardianship exchanged for payment. You call it voided, I call it criminal, and the signatures on these land deeds," he held up another sheet, eyes narrowing, "don't match any official record in Helena." Cyrus straightened. "With respect, Judge, frontier dealings aren't always tidy. But I assure you, I've no patience for forged documents, Mr. Blackthorne," the judge interrupted, "nor for men who barter children like livestock." Gasps rippled through the congregation. The preacher shook his head from the back row. Martha stood tall beside the mayor, her arms crossed and her eyes burning with righteousness. The judge turned to Elias. "Mr. McAllister, speak plainly. What are those girls to you?" Elias swallowed once, then looked down at the twins, who gazed up at him with full trust. "They came to me with frost on their faces and bruises on their arms," he said, voice low but steady. "They didn't have a name left between them that wasn't laced with pain. I fed them, taught them, held them when they woke from bad dreams. I never asked to be a father again, but they made me one." The judge's eyes softened as the girls leaned in closer, the younger one whispering something only Elias could hear. He bent his head and nodded, then turned back. "They are my family now, not by blood, by bond." The judge paused, his gaze shifting from Elias to Cyrus, then back to the girls. "And they want to stay with you?" The older twin, her chin trembling, stepped forward. "He's our pa," she said, "the one God sent us." That broke whatever thin thread Cyrus still clung to. His jaw clenched. "This is absurd," he spat. "A broken man in a shack playing father to orphans. You'd trust him over law?" "I'll trust the truth over ink," the judge replied. He stamped the document in front of him with finality. "Guardianship is granted to Elias McAllister. As for the forged deeds, Mr. Blackthorne, you'll remain in custody until a circuit marshal arrives." Gasps turned to murmurs of relief. The sheriff stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Cyrus's shoulder. The slick smile was gone now, replaced by quiet fury. As he was led away, the town rose not in applause, but in solemn silence, a recognition that justice, for once, had found its voice. And in the center of it all, Elias stood with the twins at his side, no longer a ghost among the living. He was home, and they were his. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed through the rafters of the old church like a final note in a long-forgotten hymn. It was not a loud strike, nor one made with theatrical flair, but it rang with the kind of authority that needed no volume. The weight of the moment settled over the room. All eyes turned to Cyrus Blackthorne, whose confidence had long since evaporated into sweat and clenched fists. "Mr. Blackthorne," the judge declared, voice calm but unmoved, "you are to be taken into custody on charges of fraud, document forgery, and unlawful pursuit of guardianship. A federal marshal will collect you within the week. Until then, you will be held under the supervision of the sheriff." Cyrus's mouth twisted, but he said nothing. Words were no longer weapons here. The sheriff stepped forward, handcuffs in hand, and for once, the man from the railroad didn't resist. He turned only once toward Elias, and the look he gave was not one of hatred, but disbelief, as if he still could not fathom how a man who had buried his past had found something stronger than anything Cyrus had ever bought: love. The townspeople stirred. It began with a soft murmur, then a nod, then one clap from the blacksmith, a second from Martha. Then the rest followed, rising to their feet not with the raucous joy of a crowd, but the solemn, grateful relief of neighbors recognizing something right when they saw it. Applause filled the church, echoing from the walls, from the pews, from the very boards beneath their feet. Elias didn't move at first. He stood as if carved from stone, his eyes wide, the weight of it all pressing down on him like snowfall building on an old roof. The gavel, the words, the clapping, it was all too much. His body sagged forward, not in defeat, but in something deeper. His breath hitched, his knees trembled, and then, quietly, the tears came. He knelt, shoulders shaking, covering his face with his calloused hands. The man who had once buried a wife and child with bare hands now wept not for what was lost, but for what had somehow been returned. The girls rushed to him, throwing their arms around his neck, their small voices a tangle of joy and comfort. The older one whispered, "It's okay," again and again like a lullaby. The younger twin, her voice barely above a breath, leaned into his ear and said, "You're our real pa now." Elias pulled them close, holding them as if the world might still try to take them, but it wouldn't, not this time. The preacher approached and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You brought them home," he said, "and they brought you back." Outside, the bells began to ring, not for a sermon, not for a funeral, but for something reborn. The people of Willow Creek poured into the street, spreading word to those who hadn't been inside the church. "He's got custody," they said. "The girls are his. That railroad snake's been locked up." Martha stood on the steps, arms crossed and smiling softly. "Took a ghost to show us what it means to be alive," she murmured. Elias rose slowly, the girls still in his arms. He looked out over the town, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with wonder. For the first time in 10 long years, he was seen, and not just as a man, as a father, as someone worth believing in. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In his eyes burned something brighter than fire, something the town would never forget. The snow had long since melted from the ridge, leaving behind rich, dark soil and small wildflowers that dotted the hillside like tiny stars come to rest. The trees were full again, green and full of breath, their branches swaying gently in the mountain breeze. Where silence had once ruled, laughter now rose with the wind light, high and unburdened. Elias knelt beside the old graves in the clearing, a spade in his hand and earth beneath his nails. The red shawl, faded now, but carefully mended, hung from a nail on the fence behind him, fluttering like a banner in the soft wind. The twins worked nearby, each with a small trowel, their cheeks streaked with dirt and their braids coming loose in the sun. "Put the beans close together," the older one reminded gently. "That way they grow tall with each other." "Like us," the younger replied, pressing a seed into the ground with her thumb. Elias smiled, a quiet curve of his lips as he placed another bulb in the soil. The garden stretched along the edge of the clearing now, running in neat rows beside the graves that once marked his sorrow. Flowers had been planted there, too, not to replace grief, but to grow beside it. Daffodils and lilies nodded in the breeze above the names he never had carved, because memory needed no stone. He sat back on his heels, watching the girls laugh over a crooked row, arguing good-naturedly about carrots and onions. The sight of them never ceased to move him. He still carried the old pain, yes, but it had softened, made space for something new. They had done that. With their resilience, their trust, their presence, they had made a father out of a ghost. Below the ridge, where the land flattened and the town began, the frame of a new schoolhouse rose, its roof half complete, windows waiting for glass. The preacher and the blacksmith had taken charge of the build, with help from nearly every family in Willow Creek. People came up the hill now, not out of curiosity or fear, but with baskets of seeds, tools, and sometimes just company. They asked Elias for advice. They stayed to talk. They left with more than they brought. Even the sheriff visited now and then, bringing mail or updates or sometimes nothing but silence, which Elias had come to understand as respect. That afternoon, the girls picked wild mint and tucked it behind their ears, dancing barefoot in the rows between green shoots. Elias leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching them with the look of a man who had seen the worst and still believed in the good. When the younger one slipped in the soil and came up laughing, he laughed too, an unguarded, open laugh that rolled across the garden like thunder on a clear day. The sound startled the birds into flight and brought the older twin running to his side, her smile brighter than the sun itself. "You're happy," she said, as if it were the first time she'd seen it. He nodded, his voice soft. "I am," and he was, truly. For the first time in years, Elias smiled, not with restraint or sorrow beneath it, but fully, brightly, like a man who had finally come home. The garden behind him, the schoolhouse ahead, and the twins, the daughters of his heart, laughing in the spring sun.